about the Book of Micah. It's a story of a society gone completely off the rails, a dramatic divine intervention, and a stunning promise that literally changed history. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp what's going on in this text, we have to transport ourselves all the way back to 8th century BC Jerusalem. Imagine you're walking through the city streets. On the surface, well, everything looks absolutely fantastic. The streets are just bustling with wealthy merchants. The palaces are gleaming with gold. Up at the temple, the priests are perfectly executing their daily sacrifices, and the nation appears incredibly prosperous and, frankly, super holy. But the text asks a really vital question here. What happens when all that glittering prosperity is just a mask for a rotten, corrupt core?
You see, the Book of Micah exposes a stark and honestly terrifying contrast. In God's eyes, the outward appearance of those golden palaces and the orderly religious rituals, it was a complete illusion. The hidden reality underneath was incredibly dark. The source text reveals a society where wealthy elites were violently stealing land from the poor. Judges were taking bribes right and left. Leaders were abusing their power. And the priests and prophets, they were basically just religious mercenaries, saying whatever the people wanted to hear as long as the price was right. So sure, they kept up the worship, but their hearts were light years away from God.
So how does God respond to this deep societal decay? Well, he doesn't call an insider. He completely bypasses the royal advisors in the fancy palace. He bypasses the elite priests in the temple. Instead, he calls a humble farmer straight from the dirt. His name is Micah, and he comes from this tiny, obscure village called Morsheth, which was miles away from the capital. Now, unlike his contemporary, Isaiah, who had direct access to kings, Micah was a guy who actually worked the fields and the vineyards. He knew the grit of everyday life for the common people.
And because Micah was a farmer, he intimately understood the trauma of what we would today call real estate theft. To Micah, justice wasn't some abstract academic concept. Justice meant actively defending the vulnerable. He watched firsthand as greedy landlords abused the legal system to snatch away ancestral lands from poor farmers. And you have to remember, in ancient Israel, land wasn't just an asset like it is today. It was a family's God-given inheritance. It was literally their only means of survival. Stealing it meant destroying a family's entire future. That's exactly why justice becomes the burning core of his message.
In response to this dire situation, Micah opens his book with a cinematic, truly terrifying visual. He says, "Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. He comes down and treads on the heights of the earth." God is not sitting idly in heaven just watching this corruption unfold. No way. The imagery here is of a God who has tolerated the abuse of his people for far too long, and he is stepping out of his temple to personally and dramatically confront the rampant evil on earth. Let's move on and see how this builds, because Micah wasn't just speaking in poetic metaphors, he was warning of real historical consequences. God declared that because of their constant idolatry and rebellion, judgment was coming, and it happened exactly as prophesied. Just decades after these warnings, in 722 BC, the ruthless Assyrian Empire swept in and utterly destroyed Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The judgment was very real, and it was devastating. But before we move past this corruption, take a look at the visceral, shocking language Micah uses to describe the leaders of his day. He accuses them of tearing the skin from the people, of breaking their bones, literally chopping them up like meat for the pot. Now, obviously, they weren't literal cannibals, right? But this terrifying imagery brilliantly illustrates exactly how God views corrupt, exploitative leaders. When you use your power to strip the poor of their livelihoods, well, in God's eyes, you might as well be devouring them alive. Now, if the book of Micah just stopped right there, it would be a book of absolute, total despair. But one of the most beautiful themes in biblical literature is that God always provides a light in the darkest of times. Right in the middle of this terrifying darkness and impending judgment, the narrative dynamically pivots. Micah shifts his gaze away from the corrupt present and looks toward a glorious divine future. He paints this incredibly rich picture of ultimate global peace. He prophesies a future where all nations will flow to God's presence, and they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Just think about that image for a second. The very instruments of death and warfare are forged in the fire and completely transformed into tools for farming and harvest. It's a promise that one day, under the rule of a true and righteous king, war will completely cease. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this prophecy reveals exactly where that true king will come from. This is arguably the most famous and historically pivotal prophecy in the entire book. Micah writes, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah,
though you are small, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Once again, God bypassed the great capital of Jerusalem, choosing an obscure, tiny village to be the birthplace of the ultimate ruler.
And listen, this isn't just ancient poetry. This is the very anchor of Christian history. Over 700 years after Micah spoke these words, this exact text changed the course of events. When the wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem looking for the newborn king, the chief priests and scribes knew exactly where to point them. They opened the scroll of Micah. They pointed directly to Bethlehem. This ancient 8th century BC text directly connects to the birth of Jesus Christ, who Christians believe is that eternal king, stepping right into human history.
Returning to Micah's original audience for a moment, the people were terrified. Hearing about God's impending judgment, they started panicking. They wondered, what does God truly desire from us to fix this? They ask, should we bring thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Actually, should we even sacrifice our own children to appease God's anger? They honestly thought religion was just a transactional system of buying God off with more and more rituals.
God's answer, however, cuts right through all that religious theater. In Micah 6:8, we find one of the most profound spiritual principles in the entire Old Testament. God doesn't want your outward rituals if your heart is corrupt. He requires 3 very specific things. First, act justly. Be radically honest, fair, and absolutely refuse to oppress anyone. Second, love mercy. Actively help and forgive others. And third, walk humbly. Acknowledge your need for God and rely on Him every single day. He doesn't want a performance, He demands a total inner life transformation.
As we near the end of this incredibly rich book, there's a brilliant poetic twist hidden right in plain sight. The prophet's very name, Micah, literally translates to, "Who is a God like Yahweh?" Throughout all the terrifying warnings of judgment and the stunning promises of a future king, the text is constantly pushing us, the readers, to ask this central theological question: who is this God? What is His true character?
And this brilliantly illustrates the answer. The closing of the book ends with a stunning hymn of praise that answers the question of Micah's own name. Who is a God like you, Micah asks, a God who pardons sin and forgives transgression? He writes, you will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. It's the ultimate Christian hope, really. A God whose unyielding, fierce justice against oppression is perfectly balanced by a boundless, ocean-deep mercy for anyone who truly repents and turns to Him.